Hey guys, Kevin Cleary here with a knife video for you. Today we have here the Mora Garberg. Now, I've been wanting to get a Mora for some time, and I've been aware of them and interested in them, and I just hadn't pulled the trigger, but this one was pretty interesting to me. So I went ahead and picked it up, and I will, at some point pick up another Mora. I'm not sure which one, but maybe you want to make some recommendations along those lines in the comments below. The other thing I want to ask you, and I'm going to have a bit of a discussion about this, is pertaining to scandi grinds. What do you think? Do you like them, dislike them? Do you use them? Do you avoid them? I find they have certain characteristics that I really appreciate, and then others that I'm not as crazy about. So I will discuss that a little more. So there will be a section when we discuss the blade on this knife where we take a little bit of extra time to just discuss scandi grinds and their pros and cons, and do some comparisons. Okay, so let's get back into this particular knife specifically. Now that you kind of know where we're going with all of this. By the way, notice this does have the multi-carry sheath option, and we'll talk about that as well when we get to discussing the sheath. Let's go ahead and get this out of there, and I'll move this off to the side and give you the size and weight on this knife. So this knife is 4 1/4 inch blade, 4 3/4 inch handle, about 3/4, 7/8 of an inch thick in the handle, which is important for sort of an outdoors knife. You want something big and comfortable and round. Obviously scandi grind, satin finish, and a clip point blade there. By the way, this is, unlike a lot of Moras, full tang, as you can see. So if that's something you really value, this is definitely the Mora you want to lean toward. And we'll have, when we talk about the sort of how this compares to other Moras, we'll definitely want to bring that up for sure. Weight on this is a little bit of a different animal. The knife itself weighs 5.9 ounces, which is fairly straightforward. However, because of the number of options available on the sheath, it's going to range, okay? So just the sheath, if you take this off, hold on. Seems like I'm unable to do it. There we go. So if you just take this off, the sheath by itself it weighs about 1.5 ounces. Now, if you add all of this other stuff, you add basically another extra ounce on top of that. So you're going to be looking at total weight 4.5 to 8.5 ounces, depending on how you configure the sheath on the knife. All right, so there you go. That's size and weight. Obviously, we don't care about carrying this in pocket. Now, the way I carry it is in the sheath in a backpack or in my everyday carry bag. And so, I can't tell you a whole lot about carrying it on a belt. I have done that purposely just for this review, and it carries around fine, just like any other sort of bushcraft knife that you may put on your belt. There's not a whole lot of difference, I find, with that. However, this knife is not, this sheath is not ideal for every possible way that you'd want to carry this. And so there may be some of you out there who would say, I think I'm going to send this to someone or do the work myself so I can have a Kydex sheath for it. And I think there'd be some benefit to that. Let's get into the blade now that we've sort of had a bit of introductory discussion. This, of course, is a stainless steel blade, as you probably know, because this knife has been fairly well discussed. So it's 14C28N blade steel, satin finish, clip point, and it's a scandi grind, and it's not just like every other scandi grind. You can see that this distance here is fairly short. So you've got about 1/8 of an inch blade stock, and then this fairly short grind, which actually means the angle on this is fairly steep. Okay, now it still functions like a scandi ground blade, so it does cut into material really, really nicely. But it's going to be a little stronger maybe than certain bushcraft blades where, you can imagine if we took this secondary grind all the way back to, say, here where my thumbnail is, you would get a thinner edge, of course, but you would get a less stable edge. And so I have no doubt that Mora gave a lot of consideration to just how they wanted to pull that off in order to balance strength and performance just right. And they seem to have done a pretty good job with a thicker blade stock. Now, for certain tasks and for certain kinds of cutting, you may want a thinner blade. And then, there are tons of Mora options out there that would give you that. Okay, so of course, with harder use and more durability. You get a thicker blade, you get the full tang, but you do lose a little bit. And I will say this, it's a very little bit. And I've done a lot of cutting with this knife. Just so happens that I was taking out some bushes at my house, which meant that I had a lot, and I mean a lot, of spare lumber around to do knife testing with. So a lot of it's been burned up now, but in the meantime, you know, every time I would get ready to burn some, I would take a different knife with me, or take 2 or 3 or 4 knives with me and do some cutting on that to just see how they all felt in hand. And this was one I was very interested in because it was new and because I didn't have a lot of experience with scandi grinds. So this one has been with me a lot and done a lot of sort of carving and a little bit of batoning and some preparation of firewood before I burned up all of these shrubs that I had, and of course the thick heavy branches from those shrubs. And it works really, really well, and I think they've done a pretty good job of striking that balance. Now, I do want to talk about this a little because, you know, a scandi grind is very good at cutting and carving wood because it's very thin and it stays very thin. The other cool thing about scandi grinds is if you're sort of an edge snob where you really want to see how sharp you can get the edges on your knives, a scandi grind is great because they can get hair whittling sharp fairly easily, much more easily than something like that. You know, these are interesting in that both of these are kind of marketed as outdoor survival type knives. Different classes of them, of course, but a knife like this, well, it provides some other options in terms of chopping and things like that. You're not going to get the carving performance out of this that you will out of this, not even close, okay? And someone may argue that a Mora companion or something with a thinner blade stock would even do better yet than this, and I wouldn't disagree, okay? The other thing is, with a knife like this, where you've got your flat, your primary bevel, and your secondary bevel, you have a little more to deal with in terms of how you're going to get this to finish off well, and you can do it. Of course, you could get this knife, or almost any knife, to a very, very high degree of sharpness. Especially softer steels are going to be easier to achieve that with. But it takes a little more time, a little more care to get a knife like this as razor hair popping sharp as you can get this one with a relatively little amount of effort. Okay. Now, one interesting thing that we do need to say about scandi, so we're talking about scandi grinds here now, and they do carve really, really well. They also get a really, really sharp edge, but they can roll. Okay, so you know, this is meant to be sort of a hard use knife, and there is the potential, because it's so thin behind the edge, that yeah, you're cutting into something, you go to pry that piece of wood out and you roll your edge a little bit. And that's a bit of a problem because on a scandi grind, you're taking a lot of material. When you go to resharpen this, if you do a full-on resharpening, yeah, you're removing all of that. So you've got a fair bit of work on your hands when you go to resharpen this, unless you change your, unless you actually put a small secondary bevel on this, which kind of changes the performance again. So there's a lot to consider when it comes to scandi grinds, especially though, or where I would see them working very well is in combination with something else. So, maybe you carry a hatchet or an axe or a heavy chopper or something like this, and then you have a scandi ground blade that you use for lighter cutting tasks, and you've got to take a little bit of care to make sure that you don't roll that edge. Okay, so that's sort of my take on that, and I'll bring this back up again when we get to comparisons. Okay, now moving on to the handle, it's full tang. You can see there the FRN sort of plastic material. It does have some texturing. Now some Mora knives have like a rubber insert. This one doesn't. It looks like this might be an insert, but it's not. It's just part of the same material as the rest of the handle. That said, it is very comfortable and very, very good for some really hard work. You can really bear down on this knife and be very comfortable doing so. As well, it has the extra confidence provided by a full tang, which is nice. Although I will say, there's tons and tons and tons of documentation out there of people using the other Moras that are, have a rat tail design. and getting a huge amount of utility out of them and really pounding on them without having any issues. So, you know, I'm not going to try to argue for even a second that this is like better than every other Mora that doesn't have a full tang construction. All right, so we talked about the blade, we talked about the handle. Let's get the sheath back in here. And I'll point out, first of all, that the way I normally carry this is just like this. Pop that on, and this goes in my backpack or my bag. All right. What you can do, and I have done before just for testing, is I've used this. So this piece that gets added to this, and you just kind of wrap that around. There we go. I should have adjusted it first here. So something like that. And now with this, you have a ton of options. You've got these Velcro straps, and they can go through this in this direction, right? They can go through this way. So you can attach this to molly webbing, you can attach it to a backpack, you can, you know, pretty much anything you could think of, you could attach this by using the Velcro along with the carry anywhere sheath. The other choice, of course, and I've done this quite a bit, is forget all this, just slide this guy on here, and you've got a belt loop that you can now carry the knife. And a lot of times when I carry this in my bag, I carry it with the belt loop on, just because I'm thinking, you know, hey, what if I decide that I want to leave my bag behind but take the knife, and I want to have that option of the belt loop. So this is the way the knife is most often configured for me. And it does work really well. Now this doesn't attach, right? You can see how this just slides, but the way they've constructed it and just the weight of the knife and the shape of the sheath and everything, I've never worried about it. I've carried this an awful lot in all kinds of conditions, climbing trees and doing all kinds of things, and it's never dropped for me, although I get that there could be a risk of it doing so. Okay, so the sheath is nice, gives you lots of different options for carry, except for the one that I use the most for a knife this size, and that is, you know, horizontal or hip carry. So a knife of this size, 4-inch blade, I really like to be able to either put it on my left hip like this, or let's see, how is it in there? Yeah, so I like to be able to carry it on my left hip like this, so I can sort of cross draw the knife, or in the small of my back. So again, I can sort of reach around behind me and draw the knife with my right hand. Not an option with this sheath, which is one of the reasons that maybe some people, and I'm sure there are tons of people out there who have, and tons of options for this. If you go on eBay, I'm sure there's no shortage of Kydex sheaths that you can get, which would allow you to have those carry configurations, okay? So that is one complaint. You know, this is not a knife that, you know, sometimes if I'm hiking or if I'm going for a bike ride out to the woods or somewhere where, you know, I'm going to be kind of in public and in the bush, I like to carry a knife in a way that's a little more discreet, but this doesn't really provide you with that. It's going to hang down from your belt and flop around in the breeze for most of the time, unless you are have a backpack or a bag that you can put it in. So that's my discussion of the sheath. Totally functional, gives you quite a number of options, but the one option that I like the best is really not there. Okay, let's now finally move on to some comparisons. So we'll drop this sheath and pull out a couple of knives that would maybe be options that you might carry instead. So are there some folder options? Sure, I think so. There's the Rat 1, which is really designed to be sort of a folding outdoor blade. There's the 4-Max, which would be certainly tough enough and durable enough to pretty well, I would say anything this knife could do, because I wouldn't want to really baton with either one of them. Then you have some other fixed blade options. So most people, you know, myself included, if I'm going to the bush, I'm usually going to be carrying, I always have a folder of some kind on me, but I'm usually going to have a fixed blade as well. So we do have some options along those lines. So here is the Real Steel Bushcraft 2. Now I will say this, much more attractive knife, okay? And the scandi grind is a little taller, making it thicker. So this actually slices a little more nicely. This is also D2 steel, so it's not stainless, but awesome performance out of D2 steel. The big difference, though, of course, between this and this is not so much how they cut. All right, they're both very comfortable, they're both very good, and I'll probably, you know, I'm bringing this in for a comparison. Well, guess what? When I do this review, this one will come in for comparison. but the sheath on this is a total win. This sheath is amazing. It's absolutely perfect. I've carried it in, you know, one afternoon I just spent time taking this apart and re-putting it on together and putting it on a belt and putting it on pants and like clipping it to everything I could think of. And this sheath is awesome because it just gives you so many options. Okay, so, you know, this is the kind of sheath that I wish you could always get. And the reality is, like, this is not an expensive knife. So, you know, people who are charging a big premium for a Kydex sheath, I don't really like that. I think that's a fail. I think you should just do a good Kydex sheath with every knife and charge accordingly. Another option, of course, would be a knife like this. Again, this knife carries quite nicely. It's a little thick and heavy, but this maybe would be something you'd lean toward if you wanted a more EDC type of knife that could still do most of those bushcraft tasks. But again, this is nice and thick, which is going to hurt it in terms of slicing and carving and doing like fire sticks and feather sticks and stuff like that. The other option that I've got here for you is this one. Actually, I'll bring in one more folding option. I just thought of it. The Real Steel Bushcraft folder is again a similar design, scandi grind, and this is again a very high scandi grind, so it's really thin. It does increase the possibility of rolling that edge, but it slices like crazy. Now, of course, the other option here, and this is representing, okay, a larger contingent of knives, right? This and, you know, something like your Essie Hunglis or your, you know, BK9 or any number of large choppers that are out there present an option that can do most of what this can do, okay? Not as well, granted, but in addition can chop and do some other things, you know, chop and pry and stuff like that that you're not going to want to do with this one. Now, does this one have limitations as well? Yes, it does. Now, I'm going to do a separate video where I talk about, you know, bushcraft options and outdoors options. What do you take with you in your kit? What should you take? What works well for me? What's my favorite? That'll be a different video that'll be coming up down the road when I get some outdoor footage. Right now it's cold and wet. In another few weeks, it'll be cold and dry and really nice. So then I'm going to get outside in the cold, hard snow and do some cutting stuff where I compare some various outdoor options. I'm not going to do, you know, every one of those knives, again, has some issues. None of them are perfect. And I'm not going to get into that too much because this is just comparison. So finally, let's give an overall impression on this. I think it's a good knife. I think it compares well with a lot of other bushcraft survival options. I think the full tang and the thicker blade stock, as well as the design of this handle, allow this to have a bit more versatility in terms of toughness. Even as a, you know, self-defense option, this would work pretty well. Camp knife, okay, not as good. But there are a lot of, you know, there's a lot of versatility here where some of the other knives I've shown you would not have. Okay, is it worth the extra money? This is, you know, the $100 Mora, and there's a legitimate question. By the way, I think they're around 90 bucks really. And so I think it raises a legitimate question, is it worth the extra money? Well, number one, remember you're getting this sheath with this. And I've looked online, and most Moras, if you go with the sort of multi-carry option sheath, they cost more anyway. So at $29.99, Mora is now $44 or $50. And then if you look at the more comparable Moras, like the Bushcraft Black or the heavy-duty Moras, they cost more anyway. So, you know, I think the Bushcraft Black with the carry everything sheath is like 85 bucks on knifecenter.com, and this is 95. So the reality is you're not really, it's not that big of a jump, okay, to get to something like this. Now, you know, where you really would struggle is if you're looking at the Mora Companion or the Mora Cans Bowl or some of those where they're very, very budget friendly. And are you getting enough extra out of this? Well, that's a decision you're going to have to make, right? For me, yes, I prefer a knife that's a little more robust, that has a little more strength to it. Not that I dislike those knives, and likely the Cans Bowl is on my get list, so you'll probably see that knife sometime in the not too distant future, and this one will be back to compare with it as well. Okay, so there you go. I think this knife is absolutely effective. I think it's fairly priced, and I do like it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and certainly if you're looking at buying one of these, I don't think you're going to be disappointed. There's nothing that stands out as, oh, this just sucks, or somehow it really fails in any regard. So yeah, if you like what this knife is, then I don't think you'll be disappointed. Hope you enjoyed the video, and we will talk to you soon.